Everyone. So as we transition into our next part of the year, we're going to be covering both World War One, the interwar period, and then World War Two. Two events with a lot of other important events in the middle of that really came to define our modern world in so many ways. So of course we're going to be starting off with World War One, and we're going to be talking about the causes of World War One today. So just to set the scene, we're looking at Europe at the start of the 1900s. As we'll talk about, World War I is going to start in 1914. But at the start of the 1900s, many European countries were, as a whole, very wealthy. Things are going pretty well on that front, especially because of the Industrial Revolution. They had many overseas colonies due to imperialism, as we talked about in last unit, and due to nationalism, they were competing heavily to become the strongest nations in the world. And so this competition is going to start to erode any sort of peace that had existed to this point. It's going to lead to greater animosity and distrust between these different countries on the continent. And so at the beginning of the 1900s, war is starting to seem like a stronger and stronger possibility, even in the midst of all of this success that wouldn't necessarily lead to war, or you wouldn't think would lead to war, in the first place. And so cooperation between these different countries are going to result in large alliances that, in addition to some of the other things that we talk about today, are going to provide a sense of protection should these wars end up occurring. And so in order to really understand the four main causes of World War One, which we will also call the Great War, and had been known before World War II as the Great War, we can remember just one simple acronym, and that is MAIN. And that stands for militarism, alliance system, imperialism, and nationalism. And we're going to talk about all four of those in a little bit greater detail here right now. The first of these, militarism. So this is the building up of a large military force for the purposes of war. And in terms of why this helped to cause World War I, as these different countries start to build up these militaries, it's creating this sense of tension. Even though there's not necessarily one particular war that these countries are building up these militaries for, it's sort of creating a sense of wariness and tension that when might some of those guns be pointed at me if I'm looking at an adversary or a potential adversary. And so as one country ends up building up their military, other countries look and they begin to build up their militaries more as well. And in the midst of this buildup, other countries are also trying to find advantages. And so new military technologies are being developed. You're having countries spending massive amounts of money on defense. And in terms of a large continental war, this really hadn't happened in Europe since Napoleon and since the early to mid 1800s. And so these new technologies are going to be a huge part of World War I, and we're going to talk about them in a couple days here. And then Germany and Britain in particular are two countries that are especially building up their naval capabilities, as well as their armies. And so they're trying to be strong both on the sea and on land. And, in addition to all the money being spent in these areas in terms of militarism, military leaders are also gaining more and more power because they're being seen as potential leaders within the country should there be a war. And so military leaders in Germany and Russia, they're becoming extremely powerful in these nations in the lead up to World War I. Now, the next of these in the main acronym is alliance system. So prior to World War I, and even during the war, a lot of different countries are looking around and seeing this military buildup and seeing that they may need some backup of their own, that maybe their own military might not be able to stop something or be able to keep them in the fight should a war break out. And so you're going to see a lot of different complex alliances that if one country should be pulled into the war is going to pull in a lot more countries. And we're going to talk about what that event is that sort of triggers a lot of these alliances taking shape. And so, as it says on the slide, as one country would enter the war, this would pull other countries in the alliance into the war as well. And so even a small conflict that might be set off may have suddenly, 3 other nations or 6 other nations that end up having to fight as well because they're part of this alliance. And so before World War I, you're going to see the creation of 2 separate alliances that are going to become extremely, extremely important. And they're a little bit confusing because they go by 2 different names, and I'll talk about the confusing part in a second as well. So the first one you have is the Triple Entente. They're also known as the Allied Powers. This is France, Russia, and Great Britain. The United States will join during the war and become part of this Triple Entente. And I guess at that point, it won't be triple anymore. And then you have the Triple Alliance, which is not known as the Allied Powers, but rather the Central Powers. So this is Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy before the war. During the war, Italy switches sides, and the Ottoman Empire joins, a empire that we had talked about earlier this year. Now, the other one, and one that you guys at this point are well aware of, is imperialism. And so as European powers are seeking colonies worldwide in order to both sell their goods to, because of this industrial revolution, but also to gain resources from, this is creating a lot of competition for resources and markets. And at some point, this is going to create not just business tension, but also just like geopolitical tension that may turn into fighting. And so there's a lot of tensions that are existing within Africa and Asia as these different countries are trying to gain an advantage. Colonial disputes are also creating international friction that is taking place. And so the disputes that are taking place between these European countries in both Africa and Asia are going to spill over onto the European continent. It's not just going to stay in these places. And this is especially true because the balance of power constantly is shifting. Last of the main 4 that we're going to talk about here is nationalism. This was a cause of imperialism. However, it's a little bit separate because strong feelings of nationalism or a loyalty to one's own country, own state, own nation is also giving countries a feeling of superiority, whether they be actually real, like we have more money, we have more guns, or imagined over other countries in Europe. And this is going to lead to countries attempting to compete with each other to show off their power. And this can take place in a variety of different ways. Right now, we are seeing the Olympics go on. The Olympics were reinstated in 1896 as a way for countries to sort of show off their athletic prowess as a nation in a more peaceful way, of course. But there's non-peaceful ways in which this is going to take place as well, right? Like we have the strongest military. We have the most land. We have the biggest empires. We sell the most goods. And this can lead to a lot of different tensions. And so in addition to a rise in nationalism for many established or newly established countries, places like Great Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, which as we talked about at the beginning of the year, Germany and Italy were newly establishing countries who are trying to establish their power and their place as a full-on like represented government and not just an idea. Other territories as well are also trying to attempt to become nation states in addition to that. So for instance, in Eastern Europe, and this is going to become important in the coming slides, Slavic people, which were an ethnic group of the region, they want to unite all people into one independent Slavic nation state. Unfortunately for them, much of this territory was being controlled by Austria-Hungary, which was an empire in Central Europe, which had taken over a lot of these different territories. And so this will become very, very important in understanding the true event that sort of sparks this war being set into motion, which we'll talk about in a second here. You also have Alsace-Lorraine, which is a territory on the border of both Germany and France, and during this time had been switched between Germany and France several times because both nations claimed that they were culturally more German or French and that they deserved that land. And so all of these things are sort of boiling to a head and creating a lot of cultural and ethnic tensions, not only within empires, where part of the empire wants to split off, but also between empires. And that's going to cause some of these tensions that we talk about. So one thing I want us to sort of look at on our sheet, and I want you to be able to answer this. Think about the four main causes that we just talked about. What was the most significant to the start of the war? And are there any individual causes that might have been addressed that could have avoided the war? So for instance, in that second question, like if you felt like, hey, if we just tackle this particular one, maybe the war wouldn't have started, you would talk about that. So go ahead and pause the video. I'll give us a minute or so to go ahead and answer that question, and then we'll come back to do the rest of the slides. All right, hopefully slide, but we're going to finish off the discussion of the causes of World War I by talking about the spark that started it all. So obviously you have these four main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. But the true event that's going to end up causing this war to start happens on June 28th, 1914, 112 years ago in June. The Archduke of Austria-Hungary, a man by the name of Franz Ferdinand, he is driving through Sarajevo in Bosnia, which is a Austrian-Hungarian territory. Franz Ferdinand is supposed to take over when his family member dies, the Emperor of Austria-Hungary, as the Emperor of Franz Ferdinand. So he's the person in waiting. And he's driving through Sarajevo, part of Austria-Hungary, when he is shot and killed along with his wife, the Duchess Sophie, by a man named Gavrilo Princip. And Gavrilo Princip was a 24-year-old Serbian. Bosnia considered itself part of this nation state of the Slavic states and the Serbian states, and they wanted to unite all of the Serbian peoples and nation under one government or state. And so this sort of shows that role of nationalism here. Princip was part of a terrorist organization known as the Black Hand. And they viewed a killing of Franz Ferdinand as a way to possibly convince the Austro-Hungarians to let go of these Serbian states and allow them to form their own country. But in response to the death of one of their leaders, Austria-Hungary ends up declaring war on Serbia. Russia, which had signed an alliance pact with Serbia, ends up declaring war on Austria-Hungary. Germany, who is part of the Triple Alliance with Austria-Hungary, ends up declaring war on Russia and Serbia. And so out of this want for Serbian independence, you have the official start of World War I, where all of these different countries are getting involved. Now, even though the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was of the death of a Austro-Hungarian leader, noble, aristocrat, the future leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even though this technically started with that particular situation, Germany ends up getting blamed for much of the war, escalating into a full-blown world war. And this happened for a couple different reasons. For one, Germany had become a much stronger military power before World War I. They had, because they were such a young nation, had really militarized and built up their armies more than any other European countries. They built a huge and strong army and navy before the war, and this made people feel like, hey, because you built all of this up, you sort of put the wheels in motion, you created that tension where this sort of blew up into something more. Germany had also convinced Austria-Hungary to declare war on Serbia because they wanted more territory in Eastern Europe. They wanted a good reason to attack Russia for it. When this would happen when Russia declared war on Germany's ally, Austria-Hungary. And then also, even though Belgium was not involved in any of this beforehand, Germany invaded Belgium for land, which brought France and then Great Britain into the war. And so because of their actions, they end up pulling the most amount of countries into the war, and that creates some of the blame that ends up taking place. Now, whether this is true or not is something we're going to be discussing over the next several weeks. Whether this is fair or not will also be discussed as well. All right, so as we continue to move into World War I, we're going to want to be continuing to think about all of these different causes as we consider the scope and the magnitude and the significance of this particular war. If you have any questions, please let me know, and have a good day.